Welcome, everyone. Now, today we're going to dive into one of World War II's lesser-known aviation stories, one that has all the hallmarks of a classic underdog tale, the Martin 167 Maryland. You might have heard of the big-named Allied aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress or the British Spitfire, but the Maryland rarely ever gets a passing mention. Yet its story is packed with ambition, innovation, and surprising combat achievements that deserve a spotlight all on their own. Let's explore this together. Now, the 1930s were a turbulent time for military aviation, a period of rapid technological growth that was matched only by the looming geopolitical tensions that threatened a new world war. In the U.S., the Army Air Corps was becoming increasingly aware that its existing attack aircraft, the Curtiss Falcon and the Northrop A-17 Nomad, were reaching their operational limits. Designed primarily as a single-engine machine, these planes would face constraints in both payload capacity and the ability to incorporate expanded crew roles. Now consider the mindset of military planners back then. They wanted a plane that could go fast enough to evade or outmaneuver enemy interceptors, yet also carry a heavier payload of bombs and machine guns to support ground operations. The single-engine platforms of the era were decent enough in speed and maneuverability, but lacked the space and weight allowances for a bigger bomb load or multiple machine gun positions. As nations around the world began to realize that any future war would rely more on aerial combat and strategic bombing than ever before, the need for a more capable attack aircraft grew increasingly pressing. Enter the twin-engine concept. Putting two engines on a plane, it wasn't just for show. It effectively doubled the available power, allowing for bigger bombs, more guns, even a larger crew. The concept also served a practical safety purpose. If one engine failed, the aircraft had a better chance of making it home on the remaining engine. Naturally, this approach did come with its own challenges, like the added maintenance complexity and increased production costs. Still, the U.S. Army Air Corps believed that in the long run, these trade-offs would prove worthwhile. From there, a formal set of requirements emerged: build a twin-engine aircraft capable of carrying at least 1,200 pounds of bombs, achieve a range of at least 1,200 miles, and top speeds of over 200 miles an hour. They also wanted space for 3 crew members: pilot, bombardier, and radio operator or defensive gunner, to maximize combat efficiency. Now, various aircraft designers were invited to present their prototypes to the military in competition for this new specification, but little did they know that their results would lead to one of the more surprising aviation journeys of the pre-war era. Glenn L. Martin's company, a name already associated with some successful designs, stepped forward with a bold proposition for his new Army specification. Now, known in-house as the Model 167, it was later designated by the Army as the XA-22 during testing. The man behind the drawing board was James McDonald, an engineer who believed that sleek aerodynamics could go hand-in-hand with robust combat functionality. The XA-22 incorporated a semi-monocoque fuselage structure, which was a major leap forward for the time. This approach used the aircraft's skin as a key part of its structural integrity, reducing excess weight while maintaining impressive durability. Clad in duralumin, the fuselage was designed to create minimal drag, helping the aircraft achieve higher speeds on a given amount of horsepower. It was a balance of agility and toughness, an important recipe for any plane that would face both fighters in the air and anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Now, powering this engineering marvel were 2 Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin-wasp radial engines. Each engine was air-cooled and known for reliability, but some question whether the XA-22 might have benefited from even more powerful units like the early Wright Cyclones, which were just then hitting the market. Hey, budget considerations are nothing new in defense procurement, and cost factors may well have swayed Martin's choice of engine. Even so, test flight showed that the XA-22 could still do about 280 miles an hour, a figure that was notably impressive for a twin-engine light bomber. Equally significant was the crew layout. The pilot's position up front offered excellent forward visibility for takeoffs, landings, and bombing runs. Behind him sat the bombardier, situated in a glass-enclosed nose that housed both the bomb sight and, crucially, an emergency set of flight controls. The third member took on a dual role as both radio operator and gunner. He managed a retractable dorsal turret armed with a .30 caliber machine gun and also had access to a ventral gun position. The idea was that distributing tasks among 3 specialists could boost overall effectiveness and survivability under combat stress. With its strong mix of aerodynamics, firepower, and advanced crew stations, the XA-22 seemed destined for Army Air Corps stardom. Yet, the best designs, they don't always get the contract. The official requirement soon shifted to demand a 2,000-pound bomb load, playing into the hands of the rival design from Douglas. Despite all the promise on display, Martin's plane was not chosen for American service. So why did the XA-22 lose out? while by most reports its initial performance was everything that the Army had asked for. In fact, you could argue that it even exceeded certain expectations, particularly in speed and maneuverability. The official reason for Martin's loss was the introduction of revised requirements that bumped the necessary bomb load from 1,200 pounds to 2,000. Now, this shift might sound modest on paper, but in practical terms, it meant rethinking structural integrity, engine power, and wing design to handle the additional weight. Douglas, with their Model 7B, which would eventually go on to become the A-20 Havoc, was also in the running, even though it reportedly had a crash during a demonstration flight. Douglas's plane was said to be more adaptable to the Army's newly enlarged specifications. The higher bomb load was now a pivotal factor in the procurement process, and the Army opted for what seemed to be a more scalable design. But technicalities aside, the politics of defense contracts can't be discounted. Martin may have found themselves outmaneuvered by Douglas for reasons that extended beyond aerodynamic performance. Everything from lobbyist influence to manufacturing capacity often plays a role in these decisions. Still, there was a twist to this story that no one in the Army Air Corps could have predicted: foreign buyers. Before the XA-22 had even taken off for its first test flight, representatives from France had expressed keen interest. With that, the Martin 167 found a second chance across the Atlantic. What started as a disappointment on home soil would soon become a success story in Europe and beyond. The moral? Well, sometimes a plane's fate is shaped less by technical merits and more by timing, official preferences, and unexpected global events. The French Air Force, known back then as the Armée de l'Air, was in dire need of modern aircraft to replace older models that would be woefully inadequate in modern conflict. The French didn't share the U.S. Army's revised 2,000 bomb load requirement. Instead, they were more interested in acquiring a plane that could swiftly move into production, offer decent payload capacity, and operate in a versatile combat role. Now, when Glenn Martin's team got wind of French interest, they wasted no time in adjusting the XA-22 design to suit these new customers. The production variant headed for France was officially dubbed the Martin 165F. However, it didn't just feature a name change. The French insisted on certain alterations. Chief among them were switching from the Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines to Wright Cyclones. Early Cyclones used in the first run of Martin 167Fs were slightly less powerful, leading to a mild drop in performance, but subsequent tweaks and improved Cyclone versions actually raised speed and climb rates beyond the original specs, making the plane even more formidable than before. Now, some changes were more about fitting local equipment. Instead of American-made Browning guns, the French used 7.5mm FN machine guns, a smaller caliber but simpler for their existing supply chain. The dorsal turrets were also redesigned to be lighter, improving the top-end speed and making maintenance a little easier. French engineers added external bomb racks, theoretically allowing for increased offensive payload. In reality, these external racks were rarely used. Most missions ended up hauling about 1,250 pounds of bombs internally, which was a comfortable operational load that balanced performance and firepower. What's particularly remarkable here is that Martin was able to pivot its production line so quickly. American manufacturers rarely faced such abrupt changes in the 30s, but war clouds were forming in Europe. The French knew time was short, and Martin recognized this was a golden opportunity. That sense of urgency led to a major factory expansion in Baltimore, a big move that brought in a flood of new, often inexperienced workers, many of them teenagers. It was a scramble of resources, training, and logistics that mirrored the frantic mood on the global stage. Now, when France officially placed an order for 115 Martin 167Fs, Martin's factory had to scale up at lightning speed. The typical peacetime production schedule was a far cry from the frenzied pace demanded by a Europe on the brink of war. Consequently, plant expansions occurred in a mere 77 days, an almost superhuman effort in manufacturing terms. Newly hired workers, some of whom had never turned a wrench before, had to be trained on the spot. This learning curve inevitably led to a few production hiccups, with assembly lines occasionally bottlenecking as supervisors juggled quality control and training responsibilities. At the same time, political developments threw additional wrenches into the works. When France declared war on Germany in September of '39, the United States began imposing embargoes and licensing requirements on military exports, aiming to maintain its neutrality as long as possible. Though these restrictions were not as crippling as they may sound, they did slow down deliverables. Each export required a mountain of paperwork, adding logistical delays on top of the already challenging production situation. The original French plan was to assemble these aircraft in Morocco, part of their colonial infrastructure, to bolster defenses there. But changing conditions and second thoughts about where the planes were most needed meant that many aircraft shipped overseas in parts or sub-assemblies ended up being rerouted to metropolitan France. This caused chaos in supply lines. Some planes arrived without all the equipment needed for final assembly, or the tools necessary were on a different ship entirely. As the German invasion of France approached, the clock was ticking, and many Martin 167Fs were still disassembled or awaiting final touches in far-flung warehouses. It's a testament to the Martin 167's quality that, even amid these disruptions, enough aircraft reached operational status to see action. Stories abound of ground crews in the North African territories working long nights to get freshly delivered airframes combat-ready. If you picture a teenage factory worker on one side of the Atlantic and a harried French mechanic on the other, you begin to appreciate the human effort that went into fielding these aircraft under some of the most stressful circumstances in modern history. Now, when Germany launched its invasion of France in May of 1940, time had run out. Only 78 or so Martin 167Fs were fully operational, and many of these were stationed in North Africa at first. Well, despite the challenges, the French wasted no time throwing the Martin 167, known for their service primarily as the Glenn Martin 167F, or Glenn, into combat. It served as a medium-altitude bombing role, though it was also adept at armed reconnaissance. During the critical 3 weeks of the German offensive, 4 French bombing squadrons equipped with the Martin 167 flew a surprising number of missions. They targeted supply lines, armored columns, and troop concentrations in an effort to slow down the German blitzkrieg. Equipped with a modest bomb load, these planes relied on speed and agility to evade flak and enemy fighters. Interestingly, the Martin 167 units reported fewer losses to interceptors than to anti-aircraft fire, suggesting that the design's speed and handling characteristics made it a tricky target for enemy pilots to catch, but not immune to ground-based defenses. One common tactic was to fly low over enemy positions for more precise bombing, especially against vehicles and smaller targets. While effective, it also meant increased vulnerability to ground fire. Crew accounts from this time highlight the plane's stable handling under stress, with bombardiers praising the well-placed nose section for better target visibility. The dorsal turret provided a decent field of fire for warding off harassing enemy fighters, though the French 7.5mm guns lacked the punch of a bigger caliber. But nonetheless, for a plane that hadn't been adopted by its own country's Air Force, the Martin 167 built up a respectable combat record in a short span. Its use in the critical early days of the invasion undoubtedly helped slow the German advance at certain junctures, even if the overall strategic solution would eventually overwhelm France. In the face of adversity, the Martin 167 gave a good account of itself and earned a place in the hearts of many French aviators. Now, when France capitulated in June of 1940, a new chapter in the Martin 167's life began. Orders from the plane remained on the books, but with the French government effectively out of the fight, those partially completed airframes were now up for grabs. Britain swiftly intervened, taking over the French production slots for what they redesignated as the Maryland Mark I. Despite the new name, these aircraft still bore strong resemblance to their French-oriented predecessors. One major shift came in the form of reverting to Pratt & Whitney twin Wasps, largely because Britain had an easier time sourcing American parts and engines through its established supply chains. Many of the airframes also needed instrumentation changes, replacing French-labeled gauges with Imperial units. Maintenance manuals had to be rewritten or translated, and British armorers adapted to Martin's gun stations to suit their standard ammunition belts. Early British Marylands often ended up regulated to non-operational roles, including coastal patrols and conversion training. However, there were instances where they saw real action. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm, for instance, briefly employed some Marylands for maritime reconnaissance. One such squadron, 771, was known to have used these planes to scout for enemy ships, providing crucial intelligence during a time when the Royal Navy was stretched thin. Although not as glamorous as a frontline dogfight, these reconnaissance missions were vital, often revealing the whereabouts of German surface raiders and U-boats. It was a transitional phase. The British had more advanced bombers and fighters on the horizon, like the Beaufighter, the Blenheim, and eventually the Mosquito. The question was whether the Maryland had a niche where it could truly excel, but Britain was not done with the Martin 167 platform quite yet. An upgraded variant, soon to be dubbed the Marion Mark II, would offer more promising capabilities. The majority of Britain's operational use of the Martin 167 came with the introduction of the Maryland Mark II. This updated version featured improved Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines equipped with 2-speed superchargers. The result was an increase in overall horsepower and better high-altitude performance. Top speeds now reached upwards of 316 miles an hour, a notable lead from the prototype's 280. Combined with an enhanced climb rate and a service ceiling close to 30,000 feet, the Maryland Mark II could finally be considered a genuine contender among the mid-war bombers. In terms of weaponry, the RAF typically stuck with a .303 caliber machine gun, which were standard for British planes at the time. Now, 4 fixed forward-firing guns in the wings gave the pilot a respectable punch against ground targets or enemy aircraft, and a flexible mount in the rear offering defensive coverage. Modifications were also made to accommodate that 2,000-pound bomb load, a figure that mirrored the U.S. Army's original updated specification. This allowed the Maryland Mark II to undertake medium bombing missions in theaters like North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Now, perhaps the most distinctive was the role it played in reconnaissance. Thanks to its boosted range and speed, the Maryland II excelled in long-range patrols, photo reconnaissance, and maritime search missions. Aircrews reported that its handling was predictable, and the 2-speed superchargers helped maintain engine performance at high altitudes, enabling them to outrun or at least evade certain enemy fighters. This capacity for high-altitude reconnaissance proved invaluable in the Mediterranean theater, where knowledge of enemy fleet movements could literally make or break a naval operation. From this point on, it was hard to call the Martin 167 obscure in the eyes of British Commonwealth forces. It may not have been the household name that the Spitfire or the Hurricane was, but within the squadrons that operated it, the Maryland gained a reputation for reliability, versatility, and surprisingly spirited performance. Now, one of the more memorable pilots associated with the Martin 167 was Wing Commander Adrian Whitten. Now, his personal story is a testament to how solid aircraft can elevate the prowess of a skilled flyer. Reportedly, Whitten had struggled early on with twin-engine conversions, but once he got accustomed to the Maryland's flight characteristics, he clicked with the aircraft in a remarkable way. He's said to have achieved 5 aerial victories while flying the Maryland, an almost unheard-of feat in a platform more commonly used for bombing and reconnaissance than dogfighting. He credited the plane's agility and speed for allowing him to conduct low-level passes over enemy shipping and ground targets, gathering crucial information that would later influence Allied strategy. On several occasions, he engaged in aerial skirmishes with Axis fighters, using a combination of defensive turret fire and the Maryland's forward-firing guns to hold his own. It's not every day that you hear about a bomber pilot racking up A status, but it just underscores how adaptable the Martin 167 could be in capable hands. His daring missions, often deep behind enemy lines, contributed to the Allies' knowledge of Axis supply convoys. Historians credit his observations for helping to coordinate effective strikes on Italian and German shipping, turning the tide in certain local engagements. If nothing else, Whitten's story shows that the Martin 167 wasn't just an also-ran in the annals of aviation history. It was a plane that could punch well above its weight under the right circumstances. By late 41 and early 42, the war had escalated in intensity, with new aircraft models emerging on both sides. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109F and the Focke-Wulf FW-190 redefined the aerial battlefield. In this new era of advanced performance, the Martin 167 began to show its age. Its twin radial engines, while robust, couldn't match the power-to-weight ratio of more modern designs that have begun rolling off Allied production lines, like the Lockheed P-38 Lightning or the British de Havilland Mosquito. Now, moreover, Martin's production focus had shifted to newer designs, more notably the Baltimore and the B-26 Marauder, leaving the 167 or Maryland line without significant upgrades. The few improvements that had been made, like the 2-speed superchargers, were overshadowed by quantum leaps in engine and airframe tech that was happening elsewhere. With only about 450 Martin 167s built in total, there simply weren't enough spare parts or fresh airframes to keep pace with the demands of modern war. So as a result, frontline units started phasing out the Maryland in favor of bombers and reconnaissance planes that could climb faster, fly higher, and carry heavier loads. It wasn't a reflection of poor design, but rather the breakneck speed at which World War II aviation evolved. A plane introduced in 1939 could be obsolete by 1942, especially when facing cutting-edge Axis fighters in contested skies. Once a stalwart in the skies above North Africa and the Mediterranean, the Martin 167 Maryland found itself increasingly aligned to secondary or specialized roles. Some units kept them in service as advanced trainers, allowing new pilots to gain familiarity with twin-engine procedures before moving on to heavier bombers. Others employed them for maritime patrol, searching for U-boats or enemy surface craft in areas where the risk of interception was relatively low. Now, in the French sphere, the situation was a little more complex. After the armistice, the Vichy government controlled portions of North Africa and the Middle East, and some Martin 167 still operated under their insignia. Later, as Free French forces reorganized and re-equipped with British or American arms, a few of these planes made the switch to Allied colors. Remarkably, some French-operated aircraft continued flying up to the final years of the war, mostly in territories where the Axis air threat was less intense. Even so, by the end of 1942, the writing was on the wall. The Allies had better aircraft in greater numbers, heavier bombers like the Wellington, faster fighter bombers like the Beaufighter, and specialized recon planes that left the Maryland trailing in performance. Though the Martin 167 was winding down, it had some final chapters left before its ultimate fade from the wartime stage. One of the more intriguing footnotes in the Martin 167 saga is how French forces continued to use it overseas even after it had been mostly retired by the British and South Africans. Some of these planes were repurposed for naval or coastal patrol duties, especially in the Mediterranean or in French colonial possessions. With a little modification, the Martin 167 could carry depth charges or naval mines, providing a modest deterrent against small craft or submarines. In the lead up to the Allied invasion of Syria and Lebanon, held by Vichy-aligned forces at the time, Martin 167s flew reconnaissance sorties to track Allied shipping and troop movements. Later, when Free French forces took over, the same planes switched sides. It was a curious spectacle of planes wearing the same base design, but fighting under a different insignia. Now, this chaotic patchwork reflected the fragmented nature of French political and military structures during the war. In some isolated instances, these holdout Martin 167s even participated in direct bombing missions, though typically they were relegated to targets of opportunity where minimal opposition was expected. They could still perform effectively, even if only in these narrower roles. It says a lot about how robust the design was, but eventually, even these last missions wound down as spare parts became almost impossible to find, and more modern Allied equipment replaced aging inventory across the French forces. Now, when you tally up the Martin 167's track record, it's hard not to be impressed by its adaptability. Designed in response to a 1937 American requirement, it ended up seeing the bulk of its combat across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. It served the French, the British, the South Africans, all of whom adapted the plane to meet their immediate needs, be it reconnaissance, bombing, or even a surprise for the occasional German fighter who underestimated it. Was it perfect? Hardly. Engine choices, logistical nightmares, and the rapid pace of technological change in World War II meant that it was always scrambling to keep up with evolving standards. It also didn't help that production numbers were relatively small. Yet, for a plane that never got the nod from the U.S. Army Air Corps, the Martin 167 managed to leave a lasting footprint on multiple fronts of the war. In many ways, it stands as a symbol of how a well-designed airframe can find success in unexpected ways. The rejections at home due to shifting specifications and maybe a dash of politics turned into opportunities abroad. The French and British in particular took what Martin had built and proved that the concept was not just viable, but valuable. And if the Martin 167 is overshadowed by successors, well, that's a testament to the high bar that it helped set. The next time you hear someone rattle off the usual list of World War II bombers, please be sure to not hesitate to remind them of this underrated warbird. Thanks for sticking around and exploring the story of the Martin 167 Maryland. Hey, this is one aircraft that truly deserves more recognition. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want to keep uncovering more hidden corners of aviation history, do us a favor. Subscribe to the channel and join our growing community of history buffs. We hope you found the video helpful, and remember, every plane has a story waiting to be told. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next one.